Hey there riders, Moto Journo Kris here today. I'm here with Harley-Davidson Sportster S. I did go to the launch, but I've now had the bike for a little bit longer and been able to test it in kind of more representative riding conditions, and I wanted to share with you my thoughts about this particular machine. Now, an important thing to talk about is of course the fact that from a traditional perspective this is quite a departure from the norm, and that is going to upset some Harley owners, but the obvious thing there is that this bike is not intended for you if you are, offended by this change of direction from Harley. And I would also say that there is room for the older style Harleys, but there is also a necessity for a much more high-tech, high-performance, just a new generation of Harley to keep a new generation of riders interested. Because while I certainly don't share that kind of mentality, I know there are younger riders who they want ABS, they want traction control, they want an electronic suite on their bike, and that is the expectation. They may not consider something if it doesn't have that. And as preferences go, that is certainly a valid choice in today's technological kind of world. Now, as a very quick rundown of what you're getting on this bike, you're getting 17-inch front, 16-inch rear. You're getting a 4-piston caliper on a 320 single disc on that front. Your 260mm rotor on the rear with a single piston caliper, but Brembo calipers, so that is nice to see. 43mm fully adjustable forks, fully adjustable rear shock with an external preload adjuster, which is really, really good because you can do that adjustability with no tools or anything like that. You're getting a TFT display, full LED lighting, electronics package with cornering ABS and cornering traction control and ride modes, nice to see. Cruise control as well, very, very, very nice to see. Single seat, so maybe a limiting factor for some, but with the sportiness of this bike, I'm not complaining by any stretch of the imagination. It's got a very heavily shrouded exhaust system, but it has got a nice exhaust and engine note, and certainly that character does come through, even if it is far more refined than anything from Harley before. But it is a nice looking machine. I like the overall styling, I like what they've done with the bike, and I think it works, but styling is very, very subjective, and that long headlight, it's not going to be for everyone. LED lighting is certainly the future, so good to see it. And you're getting some more bodywork to integrate everything. Obviously, the liquid cooling is a feature which is going to stand out, and for those who don't like liquid cooling to start off with, I can imagine that the style involved and the necessity of adding the radiator is going to be somewhat upsetting, but it is what it is. So let's talk the Revolution Max power plant. Quite an innovative engine, I would say, from Harley-Davidson. And 120 horsepower, 127 Newton meters of torque, I believe, in this 1250T version, which is different than the Pan America version. However, it is definitely kind of a modern incarnation of the traditional Harley. So it's more refined, it's more technological, but they've retained a lot of the character. It has got beautiful, beautiful torque, like smashing open that throttle to pick up speed between corners is just absolutely thrilling. This is a beautiful power plant, and while it is a departure from those traditional Harley-Davidsons, I do feel like it's somewhat of a natural evolution. The fueling, it's exceptional, really, really good. I mainly left it in sports mode, which is a little bit more sensitive at the throttle, a little bit more aggressive, but for general use, that was perfect. Wet in the wet. The exhaust system, very well shrouded. There is a little bit of heat that comes off the bike, particularly if you're not moving or you're moving at very low speeds, like you're stuck in traffic, so that is something worthy of keeping in mind. But the exhaust note is beautiful, it's got a great growl to it. On the startup, it sounds amazing. It really is very much kind of a modern Harley, and I love it. I really, really like that engine. It's just exceptional. There is also a slipper clutch, so aggressively downshifting quite sportily is something that you can easily do. The way it picks up power on the throttle is really beautiful, really, really beautiful. And I guess that ties into why I had so much fun on this bike. So the big difference with the Revolution Max is the more rev-happy nature, which does trade off some low-down torque delivery that we have come to expect from Harley for a considerably broader, smoother, and more sporty performance-orientated character. I don't really feel like any torque was lost overall, but you will be revving this bike harder to access it, and conversely, at lower revs, it's a nicer performance cruiser to be on around town, purely by not having all the torque come on instantly. The top end is also incredibly strong, helped no doubt by the VVT, where on the older school Harleys you want to stay in that torquey mid-range. That's a bit more like the Ducati Performance V-Twin by way of comparison, and while very different than the Milwaukee 8, I'd say there are some significant advantages, especially if you're not a dyed-in-the-wool traditional V-Twin lover with all that entails. However, obviously it can be a little disappointing in comparison if you are a fan of those traditional engines. So we've got those fairly round and wide tyres at very, very low speeds, like that around town kind of riding. It does require quite a bit of muscling to turn, and you know, it's a little bit resistant and very, you know, cruiser-like for the style of wheels and tyres on it. However, it's, you know, it's not a good representation of what the bike can do, unless all you do is ride around town at 40 kilometers an hour, which that is not why I would be buying this bike. If you can get out into the twisties, the handling is exceptional. And while it is not sports bike handling for a hypercruiser, it is really beautiful. Once I picked up speeds and got into the nice kind of twisties, which certainly, you know, the speeds were probably only 80 to, you know, somewhere over 100. This bike, the handling just came alive. It was beautiful. It ran into those corners very, very smoothly. Side of the tires, no issue at all. Steady, stable, very, very responsive as far as the handling. And certainly it was just so much fun to ride. And the character between the engine and the handling of this bike is very much that on those straights, you just smash open that throttle, onto the brakes, into the corners to wash off speed. Nice bit of torque and acceleration through the corner before just smashing it open again. And that is absolutely thrilling, absolutely thrilling. The amount of lean angle on offer is quite generous for a cruiser in particular, but I will say that I did find when it ran out, you know, you really did notice it ran out. So personally, I just minimized my lean angle through the corners. I had a lot of fun. I didn't feel like it was, generally speaking, much of a limiting factor. But again, I wasn't carrying a heap of speed and lean angle through those corners. Instead, I was braking a little bit harder into the corners and then accelerating out, which honestly was the more fun way to ride this particular bike. So in that regard, this thing is just insane. Now, certainly an important factor alongside the handling, which as I've said, I thought was really, really good, is the suspension. And so fully adjustable is nice to see. 43mm forks as well. Again, it's a nice high spec suspension system. When I picked up this bike after being so impressed with the Sportster S at the initial launch, even over, you know, fairly rough road conditions, I picked this bike up and I got about 1 kilometer and I went through a lot of bumps and I was like, wow, the rear on this is so harsh. It's not like what I remembered at all. And I thought, oh, you know, that is a departure from how I thought the bike was at the initial launch. So what I did is I took 4 clicks of preload off the rear. So I softened the rear quite a bit and that transformed the bike. So while it is still not the, you know, not the plushest thing on the rear, because you wouldn't expect it to be with only 50 mils of travel at the rear, that made it a much, much more comfortable machine. And certainly for say 2 hours of riding, it was exceptional. I was really happy with it. It is still harsh over the bigger bumps at the rear, but that is fairly typical with most of the machines which have a sportier suspension setup. And certainly as the speeds rose, it certainly didn't get any worse. I'd say if anything, at the higher speeds, it was really good. So for the sporty riding on nicer roads, exceptional. For the slightly rougher Australian roads, fiddling around with that suspension a little bit, certainly did the trick. I was very, very happy with it, and there's more room to adjust within that. And overall, I'd say from the suspension, handling and engine perspective, really exceptional. The single front disc brake, the braking performance is somewhat limited by that, and it does actually look like there's almost room for a second disc and caliper combo there, perhaps not as far as mounting points on the forks, but you know, certainly I do think that realistically speaking, the amount of brake performance is adequate. It's not amazing. I wouldn't say it's lacking either. You could do with more, but generally speaking, I was pretty happy. I guess the way I'd talk about that is certainly, again, going back to riding the bike through those twisties. There was more than enough braking performance with that 4-piston Brembo caliper and the matching master cylinder for Brembo to wash off a lot of speed and to very easily kind of control the amount of speed you were carrying into a corner. I think perhaps if you're riding significantly harder than me, it might be a little bit more of a factor. But overall, I was very, very happy at the end of the day with that level of brake performance, but I wouldn't say no to having more. A final note on the handling is that the bike does feel quite rear orientated at speed through the nicer motorcycling roads, but it works, and while it's a different handling characteristic after riding mainly naked and sport bikes for quite a while, the tyre and wheel choices really make sense here and it does work. Now, another important factor, of course, with any bikes is the ergonomics. As you can see here, it's quite in some ways a diminutive bike. It has a low 753mm seat height, and that does actually get a little bit lower with someone on the bike as far as the laden seat height. I'll jump on. So I'm 180 centimeters, I've got a 32-inch inseam. I will have a full ergos video up regarding a more in-depth look at the ergonomics of this bike, but this should give you a rough idea. And I will certainly say that I think you wouldn't want the bars to be much further forward. It's a nice, for me, seat to peg ratio, and I can lock in between the sculpted seat and the pegs, which is a real boon because it makes you feel very much part of the bike and very, you know, kind of getting right in there. There's a lot of room here as far as kind of when you're getting into the sportier riding, getting right in and having a bit of fun. So that is nice as well. But I wouldn't want those bars any further forward because it'd be a bit too much of a stretch for me. All right, so having a look at the controls here, you've got a home button and to go through the menus there. You've got your high beam, you've got your cruise control on and off, and of course setting the speed. It has the non-Harley-Davidson style indicators, which is all on one side, self-cancelling, which is nice to see. And then over here you've got the single button start, flick that down, start the bike up. And you've got your mode button there as well. And you just flick that off and it'll automatically turn itself off. And you've also got some buttons here, some hazard lights. Those buttons are for syncing your phone up, which is nice to see, but not something that I've particularly used because I don't really like syncing my phone up with anything. I like riding with nothing. All right, so let's sum up Harley-Davidson Sportster S. Overall, the engine in this is an absolute gem. I am highly impressed with what Harley-Davidson have delivered. It's got a great electronics package. It is definitely a big departure from the traditional style Harleys, but at the same time, it offers something absolutely exceptional, if you ask me, as far as a hyper cruiser. It is not a bike which is going to compete with something like the MT-10, so the hyper naked category, and it's certainly not a bike which you'd be comparing against sports bikes because again, that's just silly. At the end of the day, that is silly. However, what this does offer in this category is exceptional. I would say good competition for the Diavel from Ducati, and I would say, again, I think that that engine, that Revolution Max, could be something that Ducati would design, which really, to me, is about the greatest kind of compliment I could give Harley-Davidson when we're talking about a high-tech, high-performance V-twin, because that is what Ducati are known for. Harley, more known for the traditional V-twins, but this just goes to show that they can do the high-tech and the really cool, more modern bikes very, very well as well. And at a certain point, that's going to be the future as far as what people want. So low-speed handling, a little bit of a weakness. Once you get up to speed and out into the nicer roads, handling, I would say, is exceptional. The brakes, definitely adequate. Suspension, good, but you may need to kind of tweak those settings, and it is fully adjustable, so that's nice to see. Easy to use electronic system. Overall, cool machine, really, really interesting offering from Harley-Davidson, and a bit of a glimpse into, I would say, perhaps where they're going to head in the more technological offerings as opposed to their more traditional offerings, which are designed for the older riders who don't want to change versus the newer generation of motorcyclists who are looking for more performance, more technology, you're still very much, I would say, getting the Harley character and feel, just in a slightly different kind of flavor, I guess. And it's a really cool machine. So anyway, let me know what you think of the Sportster S down below in the comments. Would you consider one? Anything that you think they missed out on? As always, stay safe out there. Thanks for watching, and you can support the channel on Patreon.